Voters on both the left and the right have become increasingly skeptical of public opinion polls on presidential elections ever since Donald Trump won in 2016, and I don't necessarily blame them. The media doesn't do the best job in reporting on public polling, and they did a terrible job covering the performance of those polls in 2016. But I'm here to tell you that the polls are doing just fine. And you don't need to feel anxious when you see polls now that suggest that Joe Biden is doing very well against Donald Trump in 2020. As someone who follows election and political coverage fairly closely, I care about polls quite a bit. I think they're an important tool in understanding where the political winds are blowing. But that's a pretty controversial opinion. There are plenty of people who question the variability of polls to tell us much at all about voter sentiment. But let me explain to you a little bit about why I pay attention to them. First of all, most of us are running informal polls in our heads all of the time. We're using data points in the form of conversations that we have with other people, conversations that we see other people have, opinions that we observe other people expressing, or just the random facts and figures that we come across in our day-to-day lives. We filter those through our priors, where we come from, where we live, our education, what we do for work, our general worldview and temperament, personality, and that forms our idea of what social and voter sentiment throughout the population is. The problem is that poll is not at all scientific and it's very unreliable. So it creates a distorted view of that sentiment. This is borne out in the data as well. A Pew Research study once found that in general, most people tend to think that crime is on the rise all the time. I think this mostly has to do with the fact that local news focuses a lot on crime. But anyway, that runs in conflict with the fact that ever since the 90s, crime has steadily been dropping. The point is, in general, we're really bad at knowing what voter sentiment in a state or a country is simply by polling what we see and hear. This is mostly because the people that we come across in our daily lives, whether it be in person or online, is not a truly representative or random sample of our state or our country at large. In one way or another, the people that you come across on Twitter or at the grocery store or at work is in some way more likely to have come in contact with you. It's not truly random. It's actually really hard for us to access a truly random or representative sample of the population at large. But that's not the case for polling organizations and polling aggregators, who have dedicated a huge sum of money and hours worked getting as good as they can at doing just that. But it's important to note here that not all polling and sampling methods are created equal, and some pollsters are better than others at taking random samples and weighting them appropriately so that they become a representative sample of the population that they're trying to poll. No single poll can perfectly sample a population, and therefore no single poll will perfectly encapsulate the sentiment of that population. That's why polling aggregators are so important. Polling aggregators take a bunch of polls from a bunch of different pollsters and weight them accordingly so they can create a weighted average of voter sentiment over time. Using those polls, using poll aggregators along with individual polls will give a person a much better idea of what's going on around them than any individual interactions with people could. But I don't want to move too far away from the reasons why people are skeptical about polls without addressing why I don't find those reasons convincing. And the most pervasive reason given is, if the polls are wrong in 2016, why do I have any reason to believe that they'll be right in 2020? And this is where I need to take a second to talk about the difference between polling aggregators and forecasting models. So polling aggregators are just an attempt at averaging all of the same kinds of polls to try to produce the most accurate idea of what those polls are trying to say. If you go to 538 right now, you will see a poll aggregator that gives the average of national polls that suggests that Joe Biden is like +7 or something like that. Then you have the forecasting models. Those take polls as one data point. They combine it with a bunch of other data points like what's happened in the past, what events they think might happen in the future, and tons of other things to build a model to try to predict what will happen on election day. I tend to take forecasting models with a bit of a grain of salt simply because the one big thing that they have to do is try to predict turnout. Turnout changes every election, and I think predicting turnout is very difficult. We're usually met with some surprise about turnout on election day. So personally, I don't pay a ton of attention to forecasting models. However, if you are looking at the probabilities given by those models, you need to keep in mind that that is all they are, a probability. Simply put, a low probability outcome is still a possible outcome. Take this 20-sided die, for example. There's a 5% chance that on any given roll, you're going to roll a 1. And the more times that you roll that die, the more likely that a 1 will have been rolled. However, if you roll a 1 the first time you roll the die, that doesn't mean that the 5% probability of it happening was too low. It just means that a low probability outcome happened. In 2016, the 538 forecaster gave Donald Trump a 29% chance of winning. Now, that's not necessarily high by any means, but it's still just 1 in 3. So the fact that it happened is not in of itself evidence that the forecaster was wrong, because 29% is not 0%. It just means that a low probability outcome happened. Additionally, the polls weren't even that far off in 2016. Every poll carries with it a margin for error of at least 3 to 5%, and this is to account for the sampling that we were talking about earlier. No pollster can poll every single person in a population, so they have to take a sample of that population and then weight it accordingly to try to make it representative. The 3 to 5% margin for error accounts for the fact that they can't make that sample perfectly representative. So if you saw a poll that said that 39% of Americans like vanilla ice cream, a responsible reader would take that to mean that somewhere between like 36 and 43% of Americans like vanilla ice cream, with the bell curve being closer to that 39% number. So in 2016, the 538 polling aggregator had Hillary Clinton, I think, 3.4 points ahead of Donald Trump. And then on election night, she got 2.1% more of the vote than he did. A 1.3 deviation between the polls and the result is very normal, and it shouldn't give anyone more reason to be skeptical of the polling itself. Then there's state polling, which is so important because of the nonsensical way that we elect our president in this country. Instead of just counting all votes as equal, we've decided that the votes of some Americans in some states count less than the votes of other Americans in other states. Polling in states is always going to be more difficult than polling the nation as a whole, mostly just because we don't have as many pollsters in each state, and the populations of some states are actually pretty small. So you're going to see wider fluctuations between the polls and the actual results, mostly because of turnout and the events that can take place between when the poll is taken and election day. Now, there were some states in 2016 where the deviation between the polling averages and the results on election day were on the high end of that margin for error. Those were the exception, not the rule. Most of the state polling averages were pretty close to the results, but unfortunately, where there were large discrepancies, they tended to happen in the same direction. They tended to underestimate the Trump vote. Now, a lot of people took this to mean that there was a political bias among pollsters against Trump, when in reality, this was more of a systemic bias as a result of shared mistakes in assumptions that were made about turnout and shared mistakes in weighting. Mistakes, by the way, that pollsters have gone through great lengths to correct for since 2016, so much so that some argue that they've overcorrected, but that's a different topic for a different video. The other thing about polling is that it's helpful to look at other polls than just the horse race presidential election polls to see if you can find support for the argument that those horse race polls are making. Right now, that argument is pretty straightforward. They're arguing that Joe Biden is performing much better against Donald Trump in 2020 than Hillary Clinton did in 2016. But is there information or is there voter sentiment suggested by other polls about other issues that would support the idea that 2020 is different than 2016 in ways that would help us trust the idea that Joe Biden will perform better against Donald Trump than Hillary Clinton did? If you compare the polling averages in 2016 to the polling averages in 2020, you're going to see something pretty interesting. You'll see that not only is Joe Biden outperforming what Hillary Clinton was doing in 2016, but Donald Trump is also outperforming what Donald Trump did in 2016. And if you're going to investigate why that is, you're going to start seeing the first signs of how different 2020 is than 2016 was. First of all, there's no popular third-party candidate in 2020. Going into election day in 2016, 538 showed that Gary Johnson was pulling 5% of the votes from the other two major party candidate, and that factor just doesn't exist in 2020. The other thing are voters who are undecided or don't have strong opinions about either of the two major party candidates. That number was 17% according to Morning Consult after the conventions in 2016. Today, that number has dropped to 6%. That's a huge difference. And that is a big indicator as to why the election might be easier to predict this time around than it was in 2016. At the very least, it suggests some reason for why the numbers are more stable this time around than they were in 2016. Then there's the candidates themselves. It's pretty underappreciated that one of the big differences between 2016 and 2020 is how favorable Americans view the two candidates. Whether it's right or wrong, Americans like Joe Biden considerably more than they liked Hillary Clinton. At this point in 2016, Real Clear Politics had Clinton's favorability as 9 points higher than Trump's. Right now, Joe Biden's at 15.4. That's almost 60% better than Clinton was performing in the basic question of whether or not Americans view the candidate favorably. That alone could account for the difference that we're seeing in the polling numbers between 2016 and 2020. And then there's the issues. If you combine Pew and Morning Consult polls on what Americans care about most when it comes to issues in this election, Biden outperforms Trump in almost all of them except for the economy, where they split it down the middle. At the end of the day, not only do the top line numbers suggest a more likely Trump loss in 2020 than in 2016, but so do the peripheral polling numbers. These numbers can absolutely change between now and November 3rd, and you should actually probably expect them to. But if they hold up, the polling numbers could deviate from the results just as much as they did in 2016, and Biden would still win. But most importantly, you should not be looking at these polls and think that the polls in of themselves are going to make any election outcome more or less likely. Polls aren't magic, and most people don't read them. People vote for candidates based off of the candidates themselves and what's going on in the country. You should not decide whether or not to vote based on what polls say, and you shouldn't expect other people to be doing that either. When the election comes around, people still have to vote. On November 3rd, all bets are off. Polls should just be used as one of many data points that you use to get a general sense for how people in America feel about things. And that's why I use them, and that's why I think they're helpful. I totally get the emotion that gets expressed when you see a poll online and your first thought is, but what about 2016? Remember 2016? I'm just here to tell you that that emotion's irrational. Thanks everyone, thanks for stopping by and watching another video. I hope that this gives you a little bit more understanding of polls and helps drive down the anxiety that you feel when you see polls on social media or in the news and you get those flashbacks, PTSD about 2016. But listen, I think what you really should take from the polls right now is that it's no surprise that Joe Biden is doing better than Donald Trump. Donald Trump has not done a very good job at being president. And in even a semi-rational world, when you do a bad job, you are less likely to get rehired at that job when the time comes around. In 2016, a lot of people were able to write off the fact that Trump's record was a record of a civilian. And a lot of them thought that he was going to change when he became president. He didn't change. Some people would even say he got worse. Now his record is that of a president, and it's not a very good record. The other big thing to take away from this video is that people like and trust Joe Biden a lot more than they liked and trust Hillary Clinton. I thought the hate against Hillary Clinton was a little overblown and irrational, but hey, it was a real thing. It isn't there for Joe Biden. We should not think that it's weird that Joe Biden is more likely to beat Donald Trump when November 3rd comes around. But as I said earlier, vote. Vote, vote, vote. And if you live in one of the states that is having a hard time finding poll workers and you are not in a particularly high risk population, I would recommend signing up to go work at your local polling station, regardless of who you're planning to vote for. It's a really important thing, and it's a really way to give back to your community and participate in your democracy. Thanks again for watching. Like, subscribe, share the video if you don't mind. We'll see you next Sunday.